Financial Survival Network, helping you survive and thrive in the new economy. Go to CarrieLutz.com and sign up for 30 free micro trainings on financial survival.
This show is now brought to you by Miles Franklin. And when it comes to protecting your wealth, you know there's nothing better than gold and silver. That's what I'm buying. I hope you're doing the same. And once you make the decision to buy gold and silver, there's no better place than Miles Franklin. Look, they've been in business 22 years. And the reason I'm a customer is because when you buy, they ship. Go to milesfranklin.com or call them at 800-822-8080 to get a free quote. 1490 WGCH. This is Carrie Lutz. You're listening to the Financial Survival Network. If you're wondering what it's like to live through hyperinflation, what it's like when you go down to the bakery and you bring a wheelbarrow full of rubles and you come out and the rubles are on the ground and the wheelbarrow has been stolen, then Max Yemets, my next guest, who runs a blog, howtobepoor.com, can help you out. He's an expert in hyperinflation, having lived through it himself in the Ukraine in the 1990s. Max, welcome to the Financial Survival Network.
Thanks, Carrie. Very excited to be on.
And we're excited to have you because I haven't talked to many people who have actually lived through a bout of hyperinflation and want to talk about it.
Absolutely. I don't hear a lot of it out there on the blogs. A lot of the perspective that you hear is coming from sort of a academic point of view. But of course, in America, it's been a while since we had a good one. So I'm here to talk about it.
And so how old were you when the hyperinflation hit in Russia?
So the really interesting stuff happened when I was 9 years old. So I was born in 1980. And it continued for the next few years, at least through 93, 94. And those were the formative years. So I experienced everything firsthand. I got to give it to my parents, though. They absolutely shielded me and my sister from kind of the brunt of what was happening. It only took a few years when I got a little bit older to really understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that was happening during those years.
And catastrophe is an accurate portrayal, isn't it?
Well, if you consider 10,000% inflation in just 1 year, I consider that to be a pretty bad place to be. So 93, for example, if you look at the official government statistics, which you may or may not trust, but they're out there. 10,000% is what they're saying. 92 was a little bit less, quote unquote. It was only 2,000, and 91 started right when USSR collapsed. We had a 300% inflation rate, but those are kind of the dry numbers. But to convert that into something meaningful during one of the better years of this event, prices tripled. So a gallon of gas on January would be hypothetically, $4, and by the time you're decorating your Christmas tree, it's 12. So that's the sort of impact to convert it into the terms that we can understand today.
So you were in a family. Your father, you said, was in the Russian Air Force. So you had a pretty comfortable lifestyle up to that point, right?
Well, we had, so my dad was in the Soviet Air Force. And as you know, the USSR contained 15 republics, very much like the states here in the U.S. But throughout 70s and 80s, he was in the Air Force flying MiGs, and we were the evil side to you guys, and of course you were the evil side to us. I'll never forget when they were showing on public television these black and white clips of WWF, and the commentator kept saying, "Look at these gigantic Americans just beating each other up on television. Look how aggressive they are, and how capitalism is in decline. Obviously, our way is much better. So let's not be like them." But of course, there was enough pressure built up in the republics to live like the West, to have a little bit more material things and material security, that obviously led to the collapse of the entire country. But we were, again, I got to give it to my parents. They, as much as they had to hustle as kids, we did okay. Of course, when the hyperinflation came and Ukraine became an independent state, my dad was in one of the worst positions you could be, because as everybody else is on fixed income, that's the group of people that hyperinflation hits first. It doesn't, because you can't, it doesn't adjust with inflation. It just kind of lags behind. For instance, teachers who are, even in this country, they're one of those groups that don't get their income adjusted really well. When in my schools, teachers didn't get paid for like 8 months.
Really?
And when they did get paid, they got paid with the money from 8 months ago. So, they experienced something like a 1,300% inflation. So it's on my site. I mentioned it in a post. It's your $2,000 paycheck is basically being eaten up by inflation and becoming something like $150. So it was kind of good and bad, to answer your question in a long-winded way. It started out good, but then as things progressed, it was just not a very good place to be.
Right. Was there social unrest taking place during this time? Because it's really, people get somewhat desperate and theft goes up and people are stealing just to survive, right?
So people do hit the streets. They go out and demonstrate. I think Ukraine is in a little bit of a different position, because historically Ukrainians as people were, I think, invaded like every couple of years on average. If it wasn't the Turks, it was the Russians. If it wasn't the Russians, it was the Swedes. It was constantly this constant turmoil. So I think it's in the genetic pool, so to speak, to get used to that sort of turmoil. But absolutely, crime goes up. Apartment robberies go up. Property crime goes up, and people get a little bit more cautious about what they do. And of course, you can't do a lot when the money is losing value. Practically every day. As every day goes by, there's a big chunk taken out of it. So I think the U.S., to draw some comparisons, I really can't even imagine that with everybody being armed and with more guns being in the country than people. Ukraine is obviously, it was in a very different position, coming out of a totalitarian regime. I think to this day you can do time for like an empty shell. You can't even. I don't think you can even own a bullet, let alone a gun. So it's very. It was a little bit different. And again, you hear all these reports of these little things starting to happen, all in the U.S. and of course all around the world. There's already unrest. It makes you wonder what could possibly happen if literally almost every other person has a weapon.
Yeah, well, we do have this proud tradition of the Second Amendment in the United States, and an armed society is supposedly a polite society, they say. But so did your family ever go hungry? I mean, how did you get food? Because that's a big problem in these hyperinflationary times. You got to have something of value to barter for it. Either you had a currency that was of value, or you bartered stuff from your house, right?
Yes, absolutely. But let me just for 1 second go back to the gun conversation we had. I absolutely agree. As a U.S. citizen, I'm I own weapons, and one of my favorite ones is a Remington 1911, and I think it's a thing of beauty, and I can't believe that it's so designed so well that it survived 100 years of use. It's really amazing. But back to your point about food. The very first thing that happens, and I think it happens throughout all the societies that experience this type of thing, and I'm sure folks who survived these periods of hyperinflation in countries like Argentina could probably confirm this. People go back to the land. I mean, that's really all there is to it. So if currently, if you're in the United States and you are seriously considering, some sort of a crisis will hit these shores, within the next few years, and you're still in the city or you're in suburbia somewhere, you got to get out, because if you are convinced this is going to happen, that's the very first thing that people did back in my time, is they went back to the land. And the specifics are a little bit different, because in Ukraine, no generation was too far removed from the land. You always had some babushka somewhere in the village with, bacon and potatoes and pickles and canned tomatoes and cherries. You can always drop by, say hi, and she'd share with you. But in the United States, there's this, 100-year ravine between your average Joe and his closest historical farming relative, who was a professional farmer. So that's the first thing that happened. So what we did basically was, through relatives, through friends, I think we rented a little plot, plant some potatoes, and go to town. You're a farmer now. After work, you take care of them, and then on the weekends, if you have a larger plot outside the city somewhere, you basically get on the commuter train, get out of the city, and then on Sunday night, come back to the city. So it's kind of what everybody did.
Wow. A lot of our ancestors, mine in particular, never farmed. They came to this country. They worked in the burgeoning industrial economy, assembling equipment, and then they became entrepreneurs. And it's not in my DNA to know how to raise food, although my wife seems to have a better grasp of these things than I do. And I don't know how likely it is for this to happen, but it certainly is not beyond the realm of possibility. And it's certainly something that is a good idea, a good thing to be ready for. I mean, on this station, I've always talked about preparing your financial survival plan, both financial, personal, family, and community, because that's what's going to get us through this thing. I think we're going to have this hyperinflation. I don't think anything's going to stop it. Whether we have a complete currency collapse in the process, hard to know. But certainly with the price of oil, with what's shaping up in the world, we are in for a hard time.
Absolutely. I agree. I want to be cautious in kind of predicting anything, because you can certainly run out of money, but you can never run out of numbers. And if you remember, in Italy, people were buying 50,000 lira a cup of coffee, and life went on. So it's very hard to predict these things, but certainly we're starting to see some, we're hitting some historical limits here. Absolutely. But I'm very cautious in kind of knowing whether it's going to be 1 year or 10 years or 20 years. It's really hard to tell, because in the grand scheme of things, what's significant for us as humans during one human life, historically, is just, it's just a blip on the radar. So I think being ready is absolutely the right thing to do. Obviously, not everybody can go back to the land. Not everybody has the means or the desire to do that. But one thing I noticed when I came to this country, and I think it was mid-90s, is that with the amount of land that everybody owns, anybody with a house has a backyard and a front yard, and nobody could put up a 2x2 raised bed and stick some lettuce in there and just grow some lettuce. Everybody has to go back to the store and buy that little bag for $5. Always just kind of confused me. I'm like, you got all this sun, and we're here in Texas. You can grow anything here. So that's what we're doing. We can't obviously survive on it, but it certainly beats buying all this stuff at the store. So that's one thing I did notice. And then Ukraine, it's completely, it's you back to the land, you can plant anything, very fertile land, and you have a support structure for it. Like I said, you're not really too far from that in any given generation, just because of the way the country was formed and the way the country came up.
Yeah, well, Ukraine is the breadbasket was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and really a lot of the wheat and grains came from the Ukraine, if my memory serves me correct. So how did the hyperinflation end? That I don't remember. Perhaps you can refresh my recollection on it.
Sure. It ended when, ironically, they tied it to the dollar. So we all can kind of laugh about this, looking at these deficits that are spiraling out of control in all these different countries that are stopping using the dollar as a form of exchange. But back in the 90s, it really helped. Well, in relative terms, I think they tamed the inflation down to like 20 or 30% in 95 or 96, and that was considered awesome, which, for us, we're actually approaching that. I think with a real rate of inflation in this country is closer to 10 rather than the 2 that the official government statistics are supporting. So they tied it to the dollar, which, for us, there's an important lesson in there, which is when you keep supplying all this currency and you basically print currency out of control, it will continue to chase the goods and bid the prices higher until it's tied to something real, until it's tied to something, more importantly, something stable. So at the time, the US dollar was considered the most stable thing in the monetary world that you could tie yourself to. Precious metals, after so many years of living in a totalitarian country, the ownership of precious metals was completely negligible. So people went to the next best thing, which was the US dollar and the Deutschmark. We're, as Americans, everybody's in a little bit of a different position because we don't have this other US dollar to tie to when we decide that we want to control our inflation. We have, I think the only real thing we have is oil and precious metals, and it's very hard to pay for hamburgers with oil. So that kind of leaves you with just a couple of options. And I'm absolutely convinced that there will be a hard stop. But again, I'm cautious in predicting when it's going to happen.
And that is a great point, Max, because a lot of people have been predicting it, like Gerald Celente. Every 6 weeks he's predicting it. Hasn't happened yet. There's a certain inevitability about it. But on the other hand, what I'm realizing, and I caught this report on it over the weekend, is we've got this oil and energy boom going on here, and it's barely gotten started. And it's kind of the third industrial revolution that's going to take place in the United States. I don't think it's going to hit before the currency collapses, unless, the only out here, and it'll cause a deflationary collapse, so it doesn't really matter. Either way, we're kind of screwed. It's just better to have a deflation than it is to have an inflationary depression. But tying the dollar to gold, getting rid of the deficits, cutting back on militaristic adventurism, because that's gotten out of hand, and cutting way, way back on the government. I remember during our last election, where I live in New York, I was talking to a young lady who was from also, I believe, the Ukraine, and we were talking about our town supervisor, and she said, he just reminds me of an apparatchik. And we were having a real laugh
that's a good
over
term.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the guy was just a pencil pusher, unthinking, just following orders, and not capable of an independent thought in his life. And, to think that we've become a land of apparatchiks is rather distressing.
It's a weird sort of thing that I'm noticing when I compare my view on things with people who are actually born and raised here. I came here when I was 15, and so it was roughly 15 years ago. I'm 31 now. I think that this country still offers something that other countries don't, which is I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to bust my hump, and eventually things will start looking up, because the work ethic that worked for the immigrants 200 years ago also works today as well. It's just a lot harder. But that's just the way it is. You have to compete now with every kid in Cambodia with a laptop on the internet, because they can crank out the same product that you can for better, cheaper, faster. So it's just the world we live in today. But I still think that in this country, if you work hard and you're nice to people, they will leave you alone, and eventually you'll make it. It's just it's a little bit harder to do now, but I'm an example of somebody coming in here very similar to how a lot of folks here, great grandparents came on the boat, except for I came on the plane, and put in the same amount of work that I thought was required. And knock on wood, I'm doing okay. So
isn't that amazing? Could you how many other countries in the world could you have gone to and made the progress and have your chance to succeed? What other countries were available? Did your parents even think of another country to go to?
Well, not a lot. So Australia won't take anybody. You need to be a doctor with like 10 years of experience for them to grant you a visa. You need to be a highly skilled professional. Europe was just never my thing. It was too sort of divided and too, I didn't speak the languages. What else is out there? Latin America, not my thing. Canada was too cold. So, I came to good old US of A, came to Michigan, lived up north for a little bit, and then we just came down to Texas, and we're loving it here. So I want your listeners to really not let anybody dissuade them from really, really understanding that from an outsider's perspective, this is still a really great place to be. I really love the fact that you could build your life here and people will just leave you alone when you desire to be left alone, as long as you put in the work. And you just, you do good work and you're nice to people. And that's really all that matters at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, we're going to have this return to basics, basic values, and of which the Second Amendment is among the most basic, that you have the right to defend yourself and that you have the right to fail as well as to succeed. And Max, I just got one more question for you, because I've had this debate with a number of people. You were there firsthand when the Soviet Union collapsed. And if I refer to it as Russia, I apologize. I know it was the USSR and the Soviet Union, but we kind of tend to think in shorthand in the States. Right. Do you believe that Ronald Reagan's strategy played a major role in the collapse of communism around the world?
Well, I think the official policy was containment, if I'm not mistaken.
That was prior to Reagan. When Reagan came in, he was in, confrontation, engagement, and Star Wars, things like that. And, shortly thereafter, he said to Brezhnev, and I'm sure you've seen it, and it means more to you than us, said, tear down that wall. He was referring to the wall around West Berlin, which was in the heart of East Germany. And after that, things just seemed to fall apart, like instantly, just imploded in the empire.
Yes, I absolutely see your point. I'm not sure I can tie it directly to what was happening because, again, at the time...
You were young.
Very young. But what I could tell you is when Gorbachev came to power and then he kind of opened things up a little bit and people got the taste of what it's like to live your life more or less free and work for the things that you want, as opposed to, never always waiting for that bread truck and the milk truck and the meat truck. That's what I think, is starting to build up the pressure in all these different republics to really orient themselves westward. And, for good or for bad, history will tell. But at that time, I think, of course, Reagan contributed, containment prior to that contributed, and I think it was the time. But make no mistake about it, it went really quick. I mean, within days, people were like, "Yep, no more country," and then they made it official. I think on Christmas Day in 1991, went very, very quickly. And people who were living in the country at the time, they basically woke up and they had no country. The savings that they had in rubles,
gone.
Everything they ever worked for, gone. And if you remember, there was no 401ks or investment in silver or anything like that. You basically, the state pays you the pension. So it was one of those things that happen once in a lifetime, and you could see the buildup to it if you kind of look for the right things. But for the average person, you just can't see it. It happened overnight. So that's what I remember about that, and I'm sure there was a ton of work done by this side to kind of undermine that regime, and eventually, it worked. Overnight, the U.S. became the one remaining superpower.
Yeah, unfortunately, usually you need more than one superpower for either of them to stay around. That's what I'm coming to believe anyway. Hey, Max, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for sharing your insights into what living through hyperinflation really is like. It's something you need to know. It's something you need to prepare for, at least the possibility of it. We might get lucky. It might not occur. We might get enlightened leadership in Washington. We might have government of and for and by the people again. But, then again, I might hit the lottery on Friday. Right. I don't play the lottery, so I don't think that's going to happen.
Thanks a lot for having me, Kerry. I just want to make one last point here,
Sure.
which is the numbers that you see right now in the news, the 2-3% inflation.
Fantasy.
If you're buying fuel and food, which is pretty much all we buy, it's somewhere in the 10-15%. So the rule of 70, which I think people don't use nearly enough, is telling you that if something's growing at a steady rate of 10%, it's going to double in 7 years. So that loaf of bread that was just a couple of bucks before is $4.50 now. So you see it every day, but you don't pay attention to it because you have to eat and you have to drive your car. But I would really want to emphasize that people really need to look at that and sort of make a note. That's all it takes. It's just a mental note of, hey, what's happening around me? These things I buy almost every day and they continue to go up in price, but yet my paycheck is not getting adjusted. It's textbook example. Same exact thing happened back in my time in the early 90s. Paychecks never adjust, and when they do, it's too late. And we need to really be vigilant about that because, again, that's pretty much all we buy with our paychecks.
Right. And I just want to go back to those of you who remember inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. There was a McDonald's commercial, and this little girl goes up to her father and says, Daddy, what's inflation? What's inflation? And he says, well, honey, inflation is when the price of everything we buy goes up and your daddy's salary stays the same. And she goes, oh, that's bad. And I hope people can find that commercial and play it back, because that's what we're going through now. That's what you are experiencing. That's why your salary does not carry you as far as it used to. And Max, where do we find you again on the internet? Your blog, website?
You can find me at howtobepoor.com, and I also have a small channel on YouTube. It's called Reason Silver. One word, Reason Silver. I do How to Be Poor is a personal blog of mine that I kept for a few years. You can find some anecdotes from my experiences and just kind of day-to-day stuff. It's not a news blog or anything like that, but it'll give you a better idea of some of these things we've just covered.
Hey, great, Max. And by the way, we've got a new blog out ourselves, latest financial news from dozens of sources around the globe, financialsurvivalnetwork.com, financialsurvivalnetwork.com. That's our station. But also kerrylutz.com. That's where we host the shows. So everybody take a look at it. We've got great info, and I'm going to start doing daily reviews of what we've got posted there, because some of the things that we're getting, primarily economic news, talking about metals, talking about dollar collapse and hyperinflation and everything else, will blow your mind. Hey, Max, we will definitely have you on again. I can't thank you enough for my personal appreciation, because people don't share these stories. I think they're so painful for people who are adults when it happens that they don't want to talk about it. It's like having grandparents that survived the Great Depression and they only talk about it 20, 30 years after it happened. That was my experience. So, Max, howtobepoor.com. We will talk to you again real soon. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you very much, Kerry.